The sunlit sidewalk outside the downtown pharmacy should have been a place of peace for Arthur Samuels, a 73-year-old disabled veteran simply trying to refill his heart medication. Instead, it became a scene of confusion and violence. Without warning, a black-clad SWAT officer's voice pierced the calm. "Down on the ground, old man, now, or you get the volts." The command, amplified by panic and misjudgment, was directed at Arthur, whose only weapons were a cane and a slow, stiff gait shaped by decades-old war injuries. Stunned and frightened, Arthur barely had time to raise his trembling hands before pain exploded through his body. A taser shot from the officer's hand, and the electric jolt dropped Arthur to the ground, convulsing in front of horrified witnesses. The incident was not only shocking, it was tragically avoidable. Arthur had no idea that moments earlier, an anonymous tip had warned police about a suspicious elderly man possibly carrying a weapon near the pharmacy. The description was vague, but enough for local authorities to escalate unnecessarily. A SWAT unit, already nearby for training, descended upon the scene expecting confrontation. Arthur, hunched and confused, matched their imagined suspect too conveniently. His cane, tremor, and disoriented reaction were all misread as signs of aggression rather than symptoms of injury and age. The officers shouted commands Arthur struggled to hear and understand. His slow movement, a result of nerve damage and chronic pain, was misinterpreted as resistance. The lead officer, Kai Caney, mistook the veteran's hesitation as a threat. "He's reaching for something," Caney yelled, escalating the moment to violence. But Arthur had only been trying to steady himself. Lying on the concrete, stunned and humiliated, Arthur's only crime was needing medication while looking like someone police had been trained to fear. What unfolded was not law enforcement. It was a failure of judgment, fueled by assumptions, and a disregard for the quiet dignity of a man who had once defended the very freedoms his attackers claimed to uphold. Arthur Samuels lay on the cold sidewalk, his breath shallow, the barbs of the taser still clinging to his chest, as a crowd gathered around in stunned disbelief. Moments ago, he had simply been on his way to the pharmacy to collect his heart medication. A routine errand in a life already complicated by chronic pain and a body bearing the weight of service-related injuries. But now, in full public view, the 73-year-old disabled veteran was humiliated and treated like a dangerous criminal. The taser wires trailing from his body weren't just signs of a mistake. They were marks of profound injustice. His limbs trembled not from fear, but from nerve damage sustained during years of honorable military service. The cane, now lying a few feet away, had been his support for over a decade, ever since a mission left him with limited mobility. And yet, that morning, Arthur was deemed a threat. Officer Caney, the young SWAT leader on edge from a vague, anonymous tip, had made a snap judgment based not on danger, but on misunderstanding. Arthur's confusion and slow response were interpreted not as signs of age or disability, but as resistance. His raised, trembling hand had been mistaken for a hostile action. Even after he collapsed, writhing from the electric shock, the officers continued their aggressive posture. They shouted commands, rifled through his coat, and searched his pockets with suspicion. They found no weapon, only a VA identification card, a prescription slip, and a folded note reminding him to take his medication. One patrol officer hesitated, holding up the ID and softly pointing out, "He's a veteran, disabled, according to this." But that revelation was dismissed almost immediately by Officer Caney with a wave of the hand and a curt, "Lots of people are veterans. Doesn't mean he's not dangerous." The public nature of the event only deepened the wound. Families, children, and bystanders stood on the sidewalk witnessing an elderly man be physically subdued without reason. Some shouted in protest, others simply watched in horrified silence, but none could stop what had already been set in motion. Arthur tried to speak, to explain that he had no weapon, that he was confused, not defiant, but his voice was hoarse and shaky. No one was listening. The weight of his service ribbons and sacrifice meant nothing in that moment. He was seen only as a problem to be neutralized. In those painful minutes, Arthur felt stripped not just of his dignity, but of his very identity. The crowd saw a disabled man on the ground. The officers saw a suspect. But Arthur was a soldier, a patriot, a human being who had faced real threats in battlefields far from home, and had never imagined he'd be treated like this on the streets he once fought to protect. What happened to him wasn't just excessive force. It was public degradation of someone who had already given so much. As Arthur Samuels lay stunned on the concrete, his pride as bruised as his body, the murmurs of the crowd slowly rose to a buzz of disbelief and outrage. Several onlookers had already begun recording, some yelling at the SWAT team, demanding answers. Among them stood a woman in her early 40s, Elena Roberts, a local business owner and the daughter of a retired colonel. She had seen the entire scene unfold, from the moment Arthur had been misidentified to the brutal tasing that followed. Her hands shook as she dialed a number she hoped she'd never need. It was a direct line to a Pentagon liaison, one reserved for immediate veteran protection violations. She knew her father's connections wouldn't appreciate this call unless the situation was grave. But she also knew what she'd just witnessed was more than an error. It was a disgrace. Within moments, that call triggered a chain reaction that roared across the Capitol. The Pentagon's Veteran Advocacy Division classified the event under a critical incident protocol, Code Sentinel. It was rare, and it was serious. Less than 7 minutes after Arthur had collapsed, the street outside the pharmacy transformed from a confused urban scene into something unrecognizable. First came the sound, a low, pulsing thrum in the sky that grew louder by the second. 2 Apache helicopters swept over the skyline, casting long shadows as they dipped lower, circling above the SWAT unit like silent, watchful sentinels. Next came the ground response. From both ends of the block, military vehicles thundered into view. Humvees, armored personnel carriers, and a blacked-out troop transport truck. They moved with precision and purpose, cutting through traffic and sealing the street off entirely. At their center was a heavily modified LAV, light armored vehicle, its ramp already lowering before it came to a complete stop. Out stepped General James "Iron Jim" Garrison, a towering presence in full dress uniform. His rows of service medals gleamed beneath the late morning sun, but it was his expression, icy, composed, lethal, that commanded silence. General Garrison had been en route to a high-security briefing downtown when he was rerouted mid-transit. The report he received mid-air enraged him. A decorated, disabled Vietnam veteran assaulted and humiliated by a domestic SWAT team in full public view, based on an anonymous and unverified tip. He had demanded immediate deployment. Now, stepping onto the sidewalk beside his elite escort team, he surveyed the scene. The local officers looked stunned, their earlier aggression swallowed by the sheer authority now confronting them. With military efficiency, his men established a perimeter. No one moved. No orders were questioned. Arthur, still on the ground but conscious, looked up in disbelief as a combat medic knelt beside him. "Sergeant First Class Arthur Samuels," General Garrison said firmly, approaching with calm resolve. "You are not alone, and you will not be treated this way, not while I wear this uniform." The sight of federal forces and a 4-star general arriving with this level of force left the SWAT team paralyzed. Officer Caney, whose voice had earlier barked commands without hesitation, now stood pale and trembling. The scale of the response was not just symbolic, it was a message broadcast through steel, silence, and authority. America does not forget its heroes. And when its warriors are disrespected at home, justice does not crawl. It arrives roaring. The moment General Garrison reached Arthur Samuels, everything changed. The 4-star general, his voice measured but steely, ordered the medics to tend to the veteran immediately. They moved swiftly, removing the remaining taser wires and assessing Arthur's vitals with gentle precision. The contrast between their professionalism and the chaos Arthur had just endured was stark. The general kept a firm hand on Arthur's shoulder as the veteran sat upright, his face pale, but his spirit slowly returning. All around them, the city block had fallen into a strange, reverent stillness. Only the soft movements of military boots and distant rotor blades filled the silence. Turning to Officer Caney, General Garrison's gaze turned from concern to cold judgment. "What exactly was your reasoning for using a taser on an unarmed, disabled veteran?" he asked sharply. Caney, still stunned, stammered something about compliance and threat perception. The general's expression didn't change. "You mistook disability for defiance. You treated a decorated hero like a criminal in front of civilians without any real threat assessment. That is not law enforcement. It is disgrace." He addressed the crowd now gathering behind the military barricade. "Let it be known," the general said, his voice now amplified by the small comm device clipped to his collar, "that the United States Armed Forces will not stand idle when our veterans, those who've bled and sacrificed for this nation, are mistreated on our soil." His words carried through the air like a hammer of truth, cutting through the last remaining strands of confusion. The SWAT team, visibly ashamed, was ordered to stand down. Officer Caney was placed on immediate administrative leave, his badge collected on the spot by a superior. The police captain, red-faced and humiliated, tried to explain the anonymous tip, but the general was uninterested in excuses. "A false tip," Garrison said flatly, "should never result in excessive force. Your department lacks protocol, empathy, and oversight. That changes today." He called into his comm again. "Confirm contact with the Pentagon Legal Division. I want a full civil rights investigation launched against this department. I want ADA compliance audits conducted, and I want every officer retrained in de-escalation and veteran sensitivity. Today." His words left no room for negotiation. Arthur, now stabilized, looked up at the general with gratitude, still trying to make sense of the surreal shift from being on the ground to now being the focus of a federal response. "You didn't have to come," he whispered hoarsely. "But you did." "I did because you matter," Garrison replied, helping him to his feet. "You gave this nation everything. It's time this nation showed it hasn't forgotten." Soon after, Arthur was escorted into a black military SUV, headed for a military hospital, not a holding cell. General Garrison promised personally that his medical treatment, living conditions, and safety would be re-evaluated at the highest level. Behind them, the street remained closed. Military personnel began collecting evidence, while DOJ and Pentagon investigators arrived to begin interviews and seize security footage. The incident, now public, drew national attention. News outlets aired footage from witnesses, sparking a firestorm of debate over law enforcement behavior toward the elderly and disabled, especially veterans. The mayor issued a public apology. The police department's funding was placed under review, and sweeping reforms were enacted. Officer Caney faced a formal federal investigation, and his actions became a cautionary tale at police academies across the country. Arthur Samuels didn't ask to be a symbol, but through his pain and resilience, he became a voice for those too often dismissed. The consequences that followed weren't just about punishment, they were about change. Real, measurable change. And that, perhaps, was the justice he never expected, but deeply deserved. As Arthur Samuels sat quietly in the passenger seat of the military SUV, gazing out the window at the street where he had been humiliated just an hour before, a strange calm settled over him. The ache in his body still lingered, but something deeper had shifted. He had not only been heard, he had been defended. What began as a moment of helplessness had become a turning point, not only for himself, but for countless other veterans like him. His dignity had been restored, not through anger, but through the power of unity and accountability. The response from the Pentagon wasn't just about one man, it sent a message heard across the country. Those who serve are never forgotten. The police department involved underwent sweeping reforms. New training was implemented, and Arthur, once invisible, had become a symbol of change that no badge or uniform could ignore again. In a world that too often overlooks quiet heroes, Arthur's story reminds us that true respect isn't just spoken, it's shown. When dignity is threatened, even the smallest voice can echo to the highest halls of power. If you believe our veterans deserve honor, not humiliation, leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true stories that uplift and inspire, because some sacrifices must never be forgotten.